Australia, a country with the kind of development that contradicts logic. 70% of its territory is uninhabitable desert, yet it's got thriving tourism. Australia used to be a colony for over 200 years. They sent criminals there back in the days, and these days the place is a mecca for many successful people. Kangaroos and emu adorn its coat of arms, yet Australia's economy largely relies on sheep. What's even more illogical is the economic miracle of this former prison island. Australia's economy is resource-based, yet it didn't become another one of those resource-dependent countries. In only 30 years, it has transformed into one of the world's richest countries with high quality of life. Is it luck, deception, or proper management? And what future awaits the continent? In 2014 at the World Economic Forum, we heard them say, "Every time one person freely trades with another, wealth grows." It was said by the Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott. These words perfectly explain the phenomenon of Australia's economy. The key growth occurred due to competition within the domestic market and external trade. Picture this. In the 1980s, Australia was fixed on its own production. Its economy stagnated, inflation was high. Other countries shrugged and called Australia the white trash of Asia. But Australian government looked at all of this and slammed its fist on the table and said, "Enough is enough." And so reforms began. Mass privatization enveloped Australia, new laws attracted foreign capital, and the influx of migrants revitalized the labor market. The economy literally flourished. Today, Australia actively sells iron ore, coal, gold, wine, wool, beef, wheat, tourists, and educational services to other countries. Remember when I said Australia's economy relies on sheep? Well, this is no secret that Australia is the world's leading supplier of wool, accounting for 39% of global wool exports. There are nearly 3 times more sheep than people on the continent, imagine that. Maybe sheep are the key source of flourishing and happiness in Australia? Who knows? These curly woolen creatures even outnumber the famous kangaroos. Australian economy largely depends on wool, or the soft gold as Australians themselves like to call it. But the secret of Australia's economic miracle isn't just that. Over many years, the terrifying negatives of the geography and history of the fifth continent have finally turned into positives. The climate is indeed harsh, scorching deserts, rare scanty rains, and temperature exceeding 40 degrees. But Australia's coasts, washed by the Pacific and the Indian Oceans, impress with their beauty and natural diversity. Nearly 90% of Australia's animals are endemic, meaning they're nowhere else to be found. By the way, that's why kangaroos and emus are put on the coat of arms. They're, after all, some of the most well-known Australian symbols. And speaking of areas, how is it possible that such a dry continent exports wheat, rice, vegetables, and wine? Well, guess what? Australia's fertile lands make up only 6% of its territory. Amazing? Not really if you convert this number into kilometers. Australians use 480,000 square kilometers of land for agriculture, and even drier lands are used for grazing cattle, which takes up another 4.5 million square kilometers. It's a pretty big country with low population density. In 7,700,000 square kilometers, there are only 26 million people, which means if you spread people across the continent, there will be only about 3.5 people per square kilometer. If you compare it to India, it's half the size and area, yet its population is 54 times larger than that of Australia. Australians easily fit on 10% of the country's territory. They live in the coastal zone, where the climate is more pleasant, waves splash and palms grow. And even the Scorpios apologize after they sting. But the true wealth of Australia lies not on land, but beneath it. The gold rush began when precious deposits were suddenly discovered in the Australian state of Victoria in 1850s. Almost 150,000 miners rushed for gold, and this period transformed Australia quite a bit. Tons of precious metals poured into the treasury of Victoria, which by the way was in Melbourne. It was after the gold rush that Melbourne gradually became one of the largest cities in the world. They built a railway during this period and put forth several land and political reforms. And as always, human greed has its say. Gold became scarcer, while the number of miners increased. Tension escalated, leading to robbery and murder, which culminated in a rebellion in 1854. But it didn't last long. And here we encounter yet another twist in logic. The military suppressed the resistance, and the gold prospectors were brought to trial. But they were acquitted, given the right to appeal to parliament, and the gold mining licenses requirement was abolished. So in fact, the prospectors emerged victorious from their rebellion. Mineral resources continue to play a key role in Australia's economy. Coal, iron ore, gold export of these mineral resources accounts for almost 50% of the country's total exports. And that's yet another reason to be amazed. Australia predominantly has a resource-based economy. Usually this isn't the most stable position for a country because it depends on its trading partners, and it's difficult to stay afloat during crisis. In 1980s and 1990s, Australia was predicted a green future, but then something happened that no one could have foreseen: the rapid development of China. Yes, apart from reforms, Australia was also saved by the fact that a new economic superpower was growing nearby. Increasing its production, China turned out very fortunate to have a country ready to supply iron ore, coal, and other riches of the land. To this day, 1/3 of Australia's exports go directly to China, and this is an incredibly beneficial co-op for both sides. The economies of both China and Australia can be described as complementary. They're like two perfectly fitting puzzle pieces, because Australia has agricultural products, energy, and mineral resources, while China has a large population and the ability to produce labor-intensive goods. So here's your food and resources, dear China, and here's your electronics, chemicals, and machinery, dear Australians. Additionally, Australia is the largest provider of educational services. In 2022 alone, over 700,000 foreign students arrived to the land of kangaroos, and 1/3 of them were Chinese. But this partnership is not as cloudless as it seems. The level of export protection in China is high, meaning that to sell goods you need to put in a bit more effort, get permissions, comply with restrictions, and so on. Moreover, Australia has quite a few competitors who also want to partner with the rapidly growing superpower. But the most worrisome thing here is that Australia is becoming way too much dependent on China. Imagine, any political disagreement between these countries could lead to a significant decrease in Australia's export share, causing an economic downturn. And if China decides to purchase from other countries, Australia is also going to have to scramble to close this gap in its budget. 2020 vividly showed the world that randomness should not be underestimated. A lot of us still remember December 2019 when COVID-19 showed up. Back then, nobody took the spread of this virus seriously, but just a few months later, the global community was buzzing with attention, and China, of course, found itself in the spotlight. Australia initiated an international investigation to determine the origin of the coronavirus. Then there were investigations by the Australian Anti-Dumping Commission regarding goods from China, because trade is trade, but health is more important. And this was a very dangerous period for once ideally meshed partnership between the two countries. So much so that in one conversation with an Australian reporter, a Chinese official said that China is angry, and if you make China an enemy, China will become an enemy. In response, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison declared, "Say what you want, but our security is more important for us." It's little wonder that since 2021, Australia has been actively improving relations with India and Japan to minimize its dependence on one partner alone. Sorry China, it's not you, it's me. By the way, trade relations with Japan are also quite interesting for the fifth continent. Japan is Australia's second largest trading partner, and this alliance has lasted even longer than that one with China. But let's not forget that during Second World War, these two countries were staunch enemies. In 1942, panic gripped Australia that the Japanese were planning to invade their country. "He's coming south. It's fight, work or perish," read Australian propaganda posters. Australia was part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Forces, and in 1946, the country continent's military forces were supposed to participate in the invasion of the Japanese island of Honshu. It wasn't until 1952 that Japan and Australia realized it was time to become friends. Gradual, cautious effort to establish communication led to the two once warring countries signing a treaty of friendship and cooperation in 1976. In 2006, allies announced a partnership based on common democratic values, mutual respect, deep friendship, and shared strategic views to be stronger than ever. And already in March 2007, Australia and Japan signed a joint security pact, which included border security, counter-terrorism, peacekeeping operations, and much more. That's a remarkable journey from enemy to joint security over some 65 years. Friendship and cooperation sounds very noble, but we all understand that on a country scale, friendship is built solely on benefit. So let's look at the numbers. In 2022, Australia sold $52 billion worth of goods and services to Japan. This is almost 13% of the country's total exports. The situation with Japan is similar to China, because they also need raw materials for production, energy sources, and delicious fresh products straight from under the sun. But in addition to natural resources, Australia has managed to enrich its country through the quality of services it provides. And this is a very interesting point. In 2022, the economy of the fifth continent increased by $51 billion through services. The state does not live by raw materials alone. Tourism, education, finance, IT, medical services, all these areas are developing not only for the residents of Australia, but also for the country's guests. Therefore, we can say with confidence that Australia's prosperity largely depends on attracting foreign capital. Australian laws allow foreigners to buy new buildings, and China itself invests huge sums in Australian real estate, surpassing United States and Singapore. In the fourth quarter of 2022, Chinese investors bought real estate worth 600 million Australian dollars. And we can see why. Homes in Australia are a marvelous sight for the eyes, and a great deal of comfort. Residential buildings meet the highest standards. Developers are required to leave 60% of the area for vegetation, as well as provide parking lots, swimming pools, and gyms. And as we remember, the country's population fits on just 10% of the continent, and some climatically pleasant areas are not heavily populated yet, so the prospects for the real estate market are quite good. Have you ever dreamed of moving to Australia? Almost 200,000 people migrate there every year, and this is one of the biggest tricks of the Australian economy. Because they don't let just anyone in, the majority of immigrants are highly skilled workers. Australian Immigration Department updates the list of in-demand professions every 8 months. In the middle of 2023, there were programmers, engineers, doctors, builders, welders, mechanics, and other similar professions on the list. And it's not enough to just have skills necessary, it's also important to prove your professional suitability. Want to live and work in Australia? Please score the required number of points. Qualification, work, experience, age, and knowledge of foreign languages are all taken into account. But if you're indeed such a valuable worker, welcome to the continent. Australia has more than 20 types of work visas. They can be temporary, permanent, for seasonal work, or for travel purposes. Australia can generally be called a country of immigrants because their indigenous population amounts only by 3%. People born in Australia to immigrant ancestors make up to 67% of population, while others come from England, Ireland, Scotland, China, Italy, Germany, and other 45 countries around the world. But only 200 years ago, Australia was a penal colony. Back then, this hot country was not as attractive, and the Great Britain decided that there were too many people in prisons that didn't fit, so they thought, let's send them somewhere, and they let them go to Australia. In 1788, 11 ships arrived at Australian shores, which were essentially floating prisons. And that's how they essentially started building Sydney, the first permanent European settlement on the continent, which also became the center of the colony. An amazing journey from a prison island to one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But the funniest thing is that all residents of Australia are still officially subject of Great Britain and are under the authority of the monarch of another country. Yes, it sounds strange, but the residents of the fifth continent said that it's just a formality that has little to do with real life. The monarch appoints a governor general, but even he doesn't get too involved in governance. Instead, the country is actually governed by the prime minister. But even here, it's not that simple. Australians don't elect a specific person, they elect a party they trust to govern, and the head of the government is later appointed within the party. And by the way, they can make them leave during their term. Despite all of these intricacies, Australia's economy has been growing and developing for almost 30 years. The pandemic undoubtedly undermined this growth, but not for long. But the crisis of 2008 was much easier for Australians to overcome than for the majority of countries. Certainly Australian currency fell, GDP and demand for raw materials from China decreased, but already in 2009, Australia became the only developed country to show growth rather than decline. By 2022, the total export from the continent country reached $410 billion. This is almost 20% more than in 2021. Isn't it amazing? But experts are again making not very optimistic forecasts. In October 2023, inflation in Australia reached almost 5%. and Reserve Bank is tightening policy to return inflation rate to 2 to 3%. Interest rates on loans are rising, people are beginning to save their money, raw materials export prices are falling, economy is slowing down, relations with China require special attention while it's necessary to continue to establish ties with other partners. Migration flows also have consequences, because if the population is growing rapidly, you need thoughtful infrastructure for that. Professor Bob Gregory of the Australian National University noted in an interview with Bloomberg that the economy of the fifth continent is not in the best condition. Nothing dramatic yet, but each year is worse than the previous. In such a sluggish recession, Australia is like a car skating on ice, which is moving more or less by inertia, and it looks beautiful, but where it will end up is unclear. Australia still has to figure it out. A dream country, a place of development and opportunities, a continent that knows how to use its strength and compensate for weaknesses. Still, history knows many examples when things can change very suddenly.